This is David Ross, and welcome once again to the Lions Roar podcast. I'm jumping on here actually for an sort of unplanned podcast to talk about something that was posted today. It's kind of a straw man. I'm not sure whether it was put up based on a misunderstanding, or it's one of those things like, what do they call clickbait, to get more people to jump on. So basically, someone is trying to refute the claim that Shuai Jiao comes from 1920 judo, saying that it's much older. The first problem I have with this is that they're attributing it to another video that doesn't say anything of the sort, and so it's arguing a point that no one's arguing. So that's sort of one of my initial problems with it. Second of all, it has sort of these classic problems that we have when we discuss Chinese martial arts history, which is people have this relationship with their teachers. It's like a guru relationship, and they believe that if you shine light on things and talk about historical fact, that's somehow denigrating what their teacher taught or disrespecting their teacher. Whereas I feel that the truth is the truth, and we just stick to it. So we talk about Shuai Jiao, and in a lot of ways we use it now in Chinese martial arts to sort of interchangeably mean just generic wrestling. In fact, I would say if one of the errors in my Chinese history book is using the term to describe wrestling throughout most of Chinese history, when the reality is it's a little more complicated than that, because the term Shuai Jiao doesn't really appear until the late Qing, early Republic period, depending on what sources you're looking at and how you're interpreting them. And it refers to a specific tradition that we have now, which is not talking about generically wrestling. What do I mean by this? Generically, if we talk about wrestling, grappling, clearly there's a historical record that the Chinese have been doing this their entire history. You have Jiao Li, Jiao Di, a lot of different terms describing various forms of grappling through Chinese history. Probably Jiao Li being the most common. Some of these were very martial. We have the record of Jiao Li, which talks about how not only did they have things like joint attacks and choking surrounding the neck, surrounding the head, but also striking. But we don't have really a record to say consistently that this tradition of wrestling went all the way through Chinese history and goes directly into the Shuai Jiao that we have. I'm going to get into that a little bit. What can we say with certainty? What we can say with certainty is that the Shuai Jiao that we have comes from the Shampuying, because when it dissolved, these people came out, and people that had clearly been in the Shampuying established the schools that we now have, like Beijing School, Tianjin School, Baoding School. I've talked a lot about how Baoding School is a little bit different, because Ping, the godfather of the Baoding School, also said that he incorporated Shaolin, which is really, we have to understand, is generic for a long fist method that was in Hebei. There was a lot of them. They all use this term Shaolin, but we can't really say it's Shaolin like in the monastery, or like the monks were involved in it, But again, we know it goes from Shampuying. Shampuying, what do we know about it? Clearly it was Manchurians. At the very beginning it was Manchurians, because it was established by the emperor of the Qing dynasty as his personal bodyguard, and also as a form of diplomatic relations with the Mongols. Keeping good relations with the Mongols was very important to several different Chinese dynasties, but especially to the Qing or the Manchurian one. So you have Manchu wrestlers wrestling Mongolians at the beginning. Later on, the Shampuying opens up, and you have ethnic Chinese, particularly Muslims in there, and probably some Mongolians also, but clearly Manchurians. It was originally Manchurian wrestling. Though historical records tell us that the Manchus in their wrestling was not as successful against the Mongolians until they started creating a hybrid style. So, you know, we know that because of nationalism in China, particularly in the Republican period, you know, they wanted to label Shuai Jiao as Chinese. Now, it's Chinese in one sense because, you know, one of the understandings of China is that it's the five people, so Mongolians and Manchurians are part of China, you know, Mongolians, Manchurians, Han ethnic Chinese, Tibetans, and, you know, Muslims are the five people. This is why Muay Thai is the symbol of China in one sense. But, you know, in the Republic period, when they said Chinese, they were really trying to imply ethnic Han Chinese. I'm going to get there because it's a little complicated, but, you know, Tong's book, which is, you know, other than Ma Liang's book, there's two books that really talk about Shuai Jiao. Tong's book is specifically about Shuai Jiao, and Ma Liang's program had one of the 4 volumes, which was about Shuai Jiao wrestling. Tong states that he's a Manchurian and he learned mostly from Mongolians, but yet he calls it Chinese wrestling. Again, it's a historical context. It's because of the nationalism of the period. But we would say that a very, very large amount of what is Shuai Jiao comes from Mongolian wrestling and from Manchurian wrestling. Now, we can have a debate about how much Chinese wrestling, traditions that existed in China that may go back to Jiao Li, are in there, and people can disagree in you know, good faith and in good spirit, and it's an open question. Some people, you know, say, well, very little or none. I would say some, because we also know that when the Shampuying was in existence, ethnic Chinese, Han ethnic Chinese, were running wrestling schools, what they called Shuai Jiao schools, Shuai Jiao grounds, with the promise that if you learned wrestling from them, you would be able to get into the Shampuying. And there's not a lot of evidence that was true. It was a little misleading. But we know that there was still ethnic Han wrestling and having tradition, and some of them did get in, you know, even though it was, you know, maybe 5% or 10%. And so we can sort of assume or say in good faith that there must have been some Chinese stuff in there. Not only that, we know the Shampuying was, you know, a competitive team, very competitive, and they were looking for what worked. And so they wouldn't, there's no reason that they wouldn't incorporate techniques that were ethnically Han in origin if they worked. So we can sort of say it's a hybrid style. But what we cannot say is that it's a completely Han ethnic style. Clearly not. Clearly, a majority, a very important part of it is Mongolian and Manchurian wrestling, which in the Republican period was not considered Chinese, quote unquote. So we know that anybody doing Shuai Jiao from any of the schools came from Shampuying, so we know that it's not completely Han ethnic, and we cannot really establish a cohesive, direct line back to Jiao Li. Now, of course, Shuai Jiao can be written with 2 different Chinese characters. One, the Jiao has the foot radical, and probably refers to the way the legs are being used in Mongolian wrestling, and the predominance, most Mongolian techniques involve the legs. And for example, we know that De He is not even a Chinese term, it's a Mongolian term. We know there's a lot of tactics that were Mongolian that are in modern Shuai Jiao. So we cannot deny this. Cannot deny Mongolian wrestling, cannot deny these things. But, you know, the Jiao, Shuai Jiao. The other Jiao, though, is the one with the horns, or the butting. And you could argue that those that use that character are trying to suggest or infer a more direct relationship to Jiao Li, the older, ethnically Han system. But we don't know that that's true. And what's interesting, though, also, is that we know that in the Central Guoshu Academy, Originally, they wanted to use the Jiao, which is the horns, Shuai Jiao. But what they ended up using was, because that's what Ma Liang used, was they changed it to the second one, which is the one with the foot radical. And it was because one of the generals that ran the Central Guoshu believed that, because in Jiao Li and Jiao Di, which came before that, one of the things they believed was that, it was really like a gory, they used horns, they wrestled and then they used horn helmets to gore each other and like rip each other up and stuff. And so they said, this is not what we want as a modern version of a martial art. Keeping in mind the context of the period, which is that while they wanted it to be combat effective, they also were trying to keep this modern sport concept going, and also, compare it to more modern things. And one of those things that they wanted to compare it to that was modern is judo. So, another thing, the problem I have with this is that he goes, I'm telling you that, Shuai Jiao existed before judo and isn't just a copy of judo. And I agree with that. That's not what I'm arguing. But he's also sort of inferring that there's absolutely no judo influence on Shuai Jiao. And, again, this is because this is along the lines of also trying to claim that it's a purely ethnic Han art. And it's not. It's also wrong to claim, especially... Now, again, maybe you could argue, I'd have to go and look into this sort of, the people that came right out of the Shampuying and then maybe, set up their wrestling grounds in Beijing and Tianjin, because we know there are people that came right out of there and then set up their schools. Maybe they didn't have as large of judo influence. But we know that anybody that has a Shuai Jiao that came through the Central Guoshu, yes, there was some judo influence. We know that because... they looked to Japanese martial arts to modernize and organize the Chinese martial arts. And I said this over and over and over again in 1930. And that's the other thing. There's so much wrong with this statement because he goes 1920. 1920 is not what we're talking about. We're talking about 1930. In 1930, we have Tong Hao's article directly about it. He was there. We have records about it. It's not even something you could debate. It's just so black and white. They sent people to Japan to study Japanese martial arts and come back. And we know that Shuai Jiao people went and did judo. And again, everybody always wants to take this black and white approach. Reality is not black and white, it's gray. Some people say that, the Shuai Jiao people dominated. That's not true. Some people say, the Shuai Jiao people lost. Well, considering that judo in the minds of the Japanese includes the ground, probably they did, because what they said was that the Shuai Jiao people were very comfortable doing the stand-up because it's very similar to the Shuai Jiao that they were doing in jackets. But, of course, didn't know what was going on the ground. So anytime they went to the ground, basically the match was over. That's not necessarily they lost every match in the sense that they were just so unskilled. That's not at all what it was. We know Tong Hao, who's has his good points and bad points, but he's a pretty reliable source, said, and there's some other sources also, some ancillary sources, they did very well standing up because it was similar to judo. But they didn't know any ground because there's no ground. That's not surprising. It's like saying a boxer would do okay in a kickboxing bout except for the kicking. Well, yeah, because they can box. They know how to box, but they don't know how to kick because they never learned how to kick. But we know that they came back. We know that judo was included into the programs, and including the Shuai Jiao program at Central Guoshu. So any Shuai Jiao that came through Central Guoshu has some judo influence. And then, of course, for Cheng Dongsheng's lineage in particular, they relocated to Taiwan. Taiwan had been under Japanese rule. They had instituted, like they did everywhere in the school system, kendo, which is sword fighting, naginata do, which is a polearm or a lance, basically, and judo. And again, because they were trying to militarize the society so that they knew when they would, go have a war, that, people would be ready. And the same thing the Chinese are trying to do, too. So don't make it seem like it, we forget about, just what people were really thinking about and aspiring to during this period. We have sort of these fairy tale ideas. So once it went to Taiwan, a lot of people that started doing Shuai Jiao with Cheng had backgrounds in judo and other martial arts people that ended up organizing Chinese martial arts. They had first been introduced to judo, and we see Taiwan has a much more organized martial arts than mainland, and it's because of some of their more experience with Japanese methods of organization, particularly organization of martial arts. So this person's arguing a completely pointless argument because no one is saying that Shuai Jiao comes from judo. No one is saying there wasn't Shuai Jiao before judo. And also, in 1920, I understand, because judo goes way before 1920. And we know that judo comes from Japanese jiu-jitsu. So the argument is just completely backwards in so many weird ways. But what we do know is that Shuai Jiao has significant non-ethnic Han influences. Has probably some Chinese, I would argue, has some Chinese influences. I would say some of the techniques that we do clearly are Chinese, because Chinese wrestling was known more for its use of hand skills than for leg skills. And so we have a lot of these hand skills used to throw people in Shuai Jiao, in Baoding especially. And then we have clearly the Mongolian stuff. And like I said, we know, but I don't even know why anybody would argue that there isn't Mongolian influence when we have a major category of techniques that's a Mongolian term. It doesn't make any sense in Chinese. It's only a Chinese approximation of a Mongolian word. But we also can't say that there's no judo influence. People always want black and white. Truth is always somewhere in the middle. Truth is always somewhere gray. So, it's interesting that, as we're relaunching the Chinese Shuai Jiao Association, and as we're promoting it more, all these other people are suddenly starting to talk about it. I don't know if there's a direct relationship there, or it's just what we would call a coinky dink, but I'm going to continue to do what I do, which is just speak what I know to be true and try to be as direct as possible. And again, point out that the truth is always somewhere in between. So, like if somebody's arguing that, Shuai Jiao is 100% ethnically Han martial art that goes all the way back to Jiao Li, they're wrong. If they say it's, the Chinese just copying judo starting in 1920 or 1930, they're wrong also. History is much more complicated than people. People want black and white answers. They want easy answers. There are never easy answers when it comes to history. So, I just jumped in here, talk a little bit about this. This is David Ross, and thank you once again for tuning in for the Lions Roar.